as you are well aware, tonight we will be discussing a variety of issues around the theme of diversity in autism. Diversity is a topic that seemingly becomes more and more prescient in today's world, from the global Black Lives Matter movement and the responses to attacks on people of colour, to the recent anti-misogyny vigils here in the UK and many assorted ongoing battles in various countries to end discrimination against disabled people and LGBT plus people. It becomes clearer by the day that voices that have been silenced for so long are speaking up through peaceful and non-peaceful means. And tonight, we attempt to join the dots between being an autistic person and negotiating multiple identities. I would like to introduce to you our fantastic panel of autistic experts who have kindly agreed to share some of their experiences of being autistic and being part of a diverse community today. So Maya Elliott is a young patient activist. Hi, Maya. And has given a range of talks advocating for better mental health services for young persons. Maya, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and what your autism diagnosis means to you?
Yeah, my name is Maya, if you can speak Welsh, and Maya if you can't. Don't worry about the pronunciation. I am an autistic person, but I also have a history of being in the psychiatric system, including in hospitals and psychiatric wards. My autism diagnosis to me, I think it's freedom to understand my own wants and needs, freedom to know who I truly am, and I guess a freedom to make informed decisions as well and ask for the support and services that I need.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That's great, Maya. On to Savan. Savan is a content creator who speaks about his experiences as an autistic British Asian on his YouTube channel, Savan Films. I urge you all to subscribe.
Hi, everyone. I am, as you say, I'm an autistic content creator on YouTube. I've been on YouTube for nearly 10 years now, which is quite a long time considering. YouTube, it has been where everything has started for me. Savan Films started in 2014, and I started doing my autism series in 2017. Being autistic means to me that you see the world very differently to everyone else, even to other autistic people. We see the world very differently, but we all are united in the same goal to make the world a better place for just not us, but also for everyone around us.
Thank you, Sav. Looking forward to hearing more from you in a bit. Now, I'm excited to introduce Marla Thapa to you. Marla is a mom to a 16-year-old autistic boy and is also part of our Birmingham Autism Research Consultancy Committee, where she, together with myself and a range of other autistic experts, give advice to researchers on how to conduct their studies in an autism-friendly way, as I mentioned earlier.
The autism diagnosis was probably the easiest part of my particular journey and my lived-in experiences. I've actually got two boys with autism, and my eldest son is 16. He wants to have a career in media, and more so during lockdown, we love to watch cooking shows and experiment. May I add, experiment new recipes, and we've spent a lot of time during this unexpected, valuable time as a family. A little bit more about me. I'm a British-born Asian, and growing up in the 70s was never easy. I encountered racism, and since having my own children, I felt things would be different, and I felt things would change, but they really haven't. My younger son has never experienced racism within his school. Sadly, my eldest one has, but more about that later.
Last but most certainly not least, let me welcome Sarai Parla to our panel.
I live in Germany, and I am a medical translator now. I work from Japanese, German, and Dutch into English, and without being autistic, I wouldn't be doing work that I'm doing now. Being autistic to me really means like giving a name to what makes me different. I'm in every environment that I've been in, I've always felt a certain sense of disconnection from everyone else. And that also came through in the medical field, in a field where I assumed that people would be more understanding and more willing to accommodate differences and more willing to find answers. It was quite the opposite.
I certainly, I'm sure a lot of autistic people would certainly agree with not being in the career that they're in, or not doing the passion that they do, kind of without the autism diagnosis. I think, yeah, a lot of us would empathise with that. Thank you so much, Sarai. Have you encountered any misconceptions that other people tend to have about being autistic?
Yes, quite a few. I'm sure that a lot of them are going to come up again and again from other people. But I mean, obviously, the first one for me, it's usually, but you don't look autistic. Like there's some kind of look that you have when you're autistic, but you don't look autistic. You don't seem autistic. Oh, I know someone who's autistic, and they're not like you, so you can't be autistic. Or I've worked with people with autism, and they are, you seem fine. You must be very mildly affected by it. It is much more difficult, I think, coming from the perspective of a woman who has autism, because it's obviously something that people generally tend to expect to see in a man. So that's often difficult, because then you get the stereotypical, oh, but Sheldon from The Big Bang Theory has autism and he doesn't do what you do. I dream of a world where when I say I'm autistic, someone will go, oh, I mean, if it had been different, that I would have said I'm autistic, and they'll go, oh, I know this other, South African, black, whatever woman who is autistic, and I saw her doing this and this and this and this. Now that's so cool. And, now I find someone who, someone else like that.
Instead of Sheldon or Rain Man.
I think that trying to put autistic people into boxes is one of the problems that we have, both within and outside of the medical field. And trying to find a way to sort of, again, be able to kind of look at people and say, that's an autistic person, that isn't isn't an autistic person. That's part of the problem that we have. And why we need so many people advocating for autism.
What do you think non-autistic people often get wrong about autism?
A lot. There's a lot of awareness out there, but there's still a lot of stigma around being autistic in society, especially in the UK.
Could you just explain what issues did you have with Sia's film?
I haven't watched it. I watched the trailer, and I was put off from watching that trailer as well, because they got this. They played really hard on the stereotypes, especially those who are non-verbal autistic people. The community now wants, and I agree with a lot of autistic people, is now time for, rather than awareness, we've got awareness. Acceptance is the next step, logical step, but autistic pride.
Yeah, very much so.
Where parents like myself are sort of stigmatized as like the difficult parent, or just wanting too much and so forth. I mean, they say that ethnic communities are often hard to reach, but we're only hard to reach if you've not been looking for us. Yeah. Support across like public domains, education practices, like the prejudices, like to reduce those prejudices between the public and the people of ASD over time. I mean, council should really have a regard to a set of principles, recognising the importance of views, wishes and feelings of the parents and the child, and to ask the parent, because the child is supposed to be the centre of the focus, just like Harvey is the heart of that documentary. Kingsley, the character within Small Axe, was the heart of what that child needs, and that's not often delivered, I feel. And I think there needs to be a lot more media coverage in terms of raising awareness, and specifically towards ethnic communities, because every community, every child presents themselves differently.
Have you experienced hostility because of stigmas or misconceptions about what it means to be autistic?
Certainly, and actually it builds on the point that everyone's brought up, particularly Sarai, who said the comment of, but you don't look autistic. I mean, that is a form of hostility. That is saying that that's insinuating that I'm lying by saying that I'm autistic. Even just being autistic in public, so because I'm someone who stims a lot as well, I get a lot of hostility from public who look at that and immediately start to have judgments about who I am, or judgments about what I'm doing there, or why am I doing that in public. And hostility is something that I encounter every day, whether or not it's just being out and about in the community, and from comments such as, but you don't look autistic, or from gazes when I'm stimming in public, or even from healthcare workers when I'm trying to access care, or from education workers when I'm trying to engage in education, or from employers when I want to be employed. But all of this inability for, or all of the things that are inaccessible to me are they're hostile. That's the reason I can't access them, is because they're hostile to me as an autistic person and to the autism community. And having to keep facing that every day, it takes a lot to be able to even get up and go out and leave my house. And I think we need to start thinking about how that hostility is impacting the health of each individual autistic person.
Very much, and I think I mean, you know, I have Asperger's syndrome, and probably one of the common one of the common issues that I face, certainly when I was trying to access services when I was younger, was the whole problem around presenting as someone who, I excelled academically. I did theatre, so a lot of the social issues that people looked for in people with Asperger's and autism, that they didn't present. Well, these are learned behaviours. I've learned how to get on, and then I did actually try to explain that, and they were like, well, a 15-year-old boy shouldn't be able to explain that, so we can't deal with this.
Many of us who are autistic can probably relate to the fact that it's associated with a lot of mental health issues. That's one of the characters that I feel shows that if you have the training and ability and power to sort of put yourself in a position where you're doing things that you love all the time, and that you're staying healthy and active and all those kinds of things, like all of that contributes to having better mental health.
We're going to move on now to topic 2, to our second topic of the evening, barriers and representation. So we're going to look at barriers to diagnosis and inclusion, but also, why does representation matter?
Ironically, I was one of the lucky, looking back, I was one of the lucky parents who my son received diagnosis at the age of 3. And that was the easy part. It was a case of, back in them days, we didn't have smartphones. So it's a case of, here's a leaflet. And it was really the barriers. I mean, whilst he was, very young when he received his diagnosis, my own community, it was like a taboo subject. And in my experience, it was a difficult path all those years ago. I didn't, nobody plans these things. I was actually pregnant with my second son at the time, and I knew nothing about autism at all. And the barriers I felt at that time was not having that sort of recognition, like within the community. And it was almost like, keep it quiet, don't tell anyone, you may grow out of it. That sort of thing was said to me, and I felt quite ostracized, and I felt like I was, sort of almost like you can't speak about it. It was one of those things within the communities, like, don't tell anyone, etc., etc. And that was, that was the start of a very long fight. I mean, representation matters because we all bring different perspectives to the table, and we all bring different experiences. And that's how I met Anna. I contacted her, and she came and gave a plug-in talk to my son's school and raised autism awareness. And when I saw how passionately she spoke about her two sons, it sort of gave me a voice. And I thought, why should I keep it quiet? Why should I, why is this barrier up against me? Why should I stay quiet about it? So there was a position then, he was in mainstream at the time, going as an SEN governor. So I just went for the kill and I applied for it. And my statement went out to all the parents within the community, stating that I have a son with a disability, and that was that. That was one way of putting it out there, I guess. But I felt like her voice gave me a voice, and my voice then gave my son a voice, because then he asked if he was autistic. He was at an age where I could share his diagnosis, and it completely transformed him. The bullying stopped.
I think that's something we all have to take away, is that it's that old adage, be the change yourself, and that can be difficult, and that can involve being really brave, and putting yourself into some uncomfortable situations.
There's a series called The A Word on BBC, BBC 102. It's been going on for a while now. It's a very good representation of autistic people. Yes, the person who's autistic is a white cisgender male. However, the portrayal is very good. They have a lot of research. They've done a lot of research behind the scenes and everything, and made it a proper portrayal of an autistic person, how they interact with the world. I haven't seen a portrayal featuring someone like me, British Asian. I haven't seen anyone like me properly. I might have missed it. There was actually one in Indian cinema, Bollywood. My Name is Khan. Bollywood actor Shah Rukh Khan portrayed an autistic character, someone who had Asperger's, and it was set in America and New York. That I thought was an okay portrayal of someone who was autistic. I would say that I was diagnosed when I was 24. So going back to I was like 2, my family knew, my parents knew, they knew that I had learning difficulties. They noticed, the special needs people noticed when I was 2. So I had support throughout my life to university. It's only when I was 23 when one of my former work colleagues noticed, you're not just dyslexic, which I was diagnosed when I was 17. They missed it completely. Being dyslexic, the stigmas of surrounding being dyslexic wasn't as bad as someone who is autistic. Weirdly, it just like, it wasn't as bad, I found, in the Indian community in general. More people were like open about that than, let's say, mental health and disability.
Maya, you were diagnosed quite late, at 15 years old. From your experience, can you tell us a little bit about why you think it took healthcare professionals so long to spot your autism?
I was quiet and I didn't disrupt anyone, is the very short answer. I sat in the back of the class. I didn't really speak. I didn't really speak to anyone so that no one brought up any concerns, because I wasn't the disruptive one in the class. I wasn't disruptive at home, and I wasn't disruptive when I was, seeing a health professional. So it was kind of the only reason I was diagnosed was when I started to be disruptive, because I was in distress, and that was the only way that I would have been diagnosed. And there were plenty of signs that I was autistic when I was growing up. I mean, a simple one was that I kept having to have hearing tests because everyone thought I couldn't hear, but actually it was more that I couldn't process voices. So I had like 3 hearing tests every year, and someone should have gone, oh, hang on a minute, it's not the hearing, it's something else. but because I never, I didn't have big meltdowns, I just had shutdowns, and I was really good in school.
How do you feel that your autism diagnosis affected the mental health care that you received?
In a very small number of cases, maybe one or two, I was under mental health care for 10 years of my life. And one or two professionals that I ever met, it improved my care because they had a decent understanding of what autism was. And they had the foresight to understand how me as an autistic person. In other cases, it made healthcare or made the care I received worse because the complete lacking of training and understanding and will of professionals to support me in the ways that I need to support. I've ended up in places such as psychiatric units that are really not the place I should have been. They were very, very unsuitable and actually made me worse. And I've had a lot of traumatic experiences because I'm an autistic person trying to access a service designed for neurotypical people.
Can you tell us a little bit about the barriers you faced and kind of the chances of diagnosis between South Africa versus Germany? Do you think it was harder for you to get a diagnosis because you're a black female?
I want to say I didn't see any opportunities at the time when I left South Africa. I didn't see any opportunities for diagnosis as an adult in South Africa. So I would say I don't think I would have been diagnosed if I hadn't left, if I hadn't immigrated to Germany. So that's one of the big things. So barriers to diagnosis. I mean, yes, I think because there's so many, it's really hard to narrow it down. There's the fact that we don't have a lot of people who specialize in autism. There isn't an established formal, it's not like cardiology or pediatrics where the field is well established and there's a long history of research, and I think that disadvantages a lot of people, but especially if you don't fit this classical textbook picture of a young male with very poor social skills, etc. I mean, if you're female and if you're a person of color, you'll obviously be seen differently, or people will consider different explanations for your behavior than autism initially, and that does make it hard.
What do you think are the major challenges that you have faced because you're autistic, and how can society change this?
All we ask is for accommodations and support to just make it thrive in the work environment, especially. There are companies out there that are willing to hire autistic people and make the adaptations to each single autistic person, not a generalized approach.
I'm going to go with a bit more of a radical answer and just say, can we just knock society down and start again, please? Make it accessible to everyone. On a more serious note, I think that there are things that we can do to make society accessible, and the key thing in doing that is including the people who need to be able to access society. So don't just go ahead and make decisions thinking that you can speak on behalf of autistic people, for example, without actually speaking to autistic people and their families. And I think there are things happening now, like Autism Hour in certain shops, and autism-friendly screenings at cinemas and things like that.
It's a long way to go, Matt. But I think there's been so much awareness in the media, which I think is really fundamental and important. I also watched the same film that Sav referred to, My Name is Con, and that was like a breakthrough within the community, I feel, and it raised a lot of autism. I think the other breakthrough to consider is fighting for your child's education and their right to the education.
I think there definitely needs to be a lot more cultural awareness. I'll just use a simple example of something that, a phenomenon that I see in Germany. There are a lot of people who live in Germany who feel that people who come into Germany should make every effort to adopt the culture and the language and fit in, and which, I mean, everyone's entitled to think that way. The thing is, though, it's much easier when someone can tell you, well, you know how in your culture you do this? Well, in our culture, we do this type of thing. It's easier. It's so much easier when there's an exchange, and that exchange is missing in both the medical field, but also in the general social environment. I mean, if neurotypicals could just be like, well, you know that we do, when we do this stuff, well, if you as an autistic person do this kind of stuff, and it's kind of the same. I'd love that. I mean, that would be fantastic. I think that would solve a lot of problems.
Yeah, definitely. Which issues that affect your life as an autistic person would you most like to be researched or better researched?
So it'd be great to have some more research around what barriers autistic people face, and then actually how do we address those barriers? So there's some really great research going on at the moment, but we need to do more of that type of research and less of, I wonder if we can cure autism. Can we not have that, please?
Yes, I can. Getting the medical model as much as possible. Yeah, I can certainly agree with that. Marla, what are the most important aspects when creating an educational environment for autistic pupils?
There's got to be a key focus is with the strength of the person at the forefront. And each child, young person, adult should be treated with respect and dignity, and more importantly, treated equally, irrespective of gender, irrespective of background, and irrespective of their race. And I think that's got to be a lot more looked at. There's got to be a much more serene environment. There's got to be a lot more sort of training that goes out there. And it's like that famous saying, when you meet one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. One box does not fit all.
Autism and multilingualism. Someone in the Q&A said that my son's school has exempt him from learning the normally prerequisite second language because he's autistic, as it will be confusing for him. I feel otherwise. What's your views on that?
I don't think that there's any research that would support specifically autistic children becoming confused by more than one language. I believe, and I haven't backed this up with research, but from what I've read, I believe that it's partly because of the way that we encode information as autistic people. We have I would think of it as we have a very nice storage system for putting information into. The problem is usually getting the information out of there and putting it in a way that the rest of the world understands. But when it comes to encoding information, I think we're actually, as autistic people, very good at that. So I would actually go the other way and say, actually encourage autistic children to learn more languages. It gives you a skill that you can later use to, I mean, like in my case, I'll obviously say make money, but it gives you a skill, and it also gives you a lot of self-confidence to be able to do something and stick with something that other people aren't always able.
It's been a fantastic discussion from all of our panelists. Unfortunately, we are running out of time for more questions from the audience. Yes, this is our second panel where we are going to be discussing issues around diversity and inclusion in autism research. Very prescient indeed. Our first panelist is Desi Jones, who is joining us from Dallas and a third-year PhD student.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm Desi, and I work with Dr. Noah Sasson at the University of Texas at Dallas, and I'm really interested in how autistic people are perceived by others and how biases in non-autistic people shape the experiences of autistic adults. In terms of my priorities, I think that much greater focus should be placed on ways to improve autistic social experiences by targeting the biases and behaviors of non-autistic people. So instead of asking autistic people to mask their autistic traits, we should place more emphasis on reducing the stigmatization of these traits. Another priority of mine is ensuring that our research is representative of the diversity found in the autistic community. So earlier, Sarai and a lot of the panelists touched on the issue of how autism is often perceived as something that predominantly impacts white males, people of color, women, non-binary people, non-speaking people. I could go on, but these individuals are typically underrepresented in our research studies. So for many reasons, which I'll dive into later, I think that we need to do a better job of including these people. And then just finally, as a neurodivergent person myself, I have ADHD. I'm really interested in neurodiversity and ways to celebrate the strengths and differences that we see in neurodivergent people, including autistic people. So I'm really excited to talk about these topics today and to hear from the other panelists.
Thank you very much, Desi. I'd like to introduce Rubes Walsh, who is joining us today from Amsterdam, where they are a PhD researcher studying socio-cognitive development and identity in autistic and transgender people.
Hi, thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed everything I've had the opportunity to listen to so far, so thank you. I guess the first thing I am is a feminist, an intersectional one, I hope, and a scientist. I'm also autistic and a non-binary trans woman. And I think in general, as the sort of overarching theme of my work is about trying to sort of put back the social and political context that a lot of scientists would rather ignore and pretend would make them less objective, back into the science, and then also trying to sort of sneak scientific thinking back into social and political conversations, basically disguised as jokes. At some point in my teen years, my two nerdy special interests, autistic special interests of music and neuroscience, had the opportunity to combine, and I went and spent some time working with Lauren Stewart and Pam Heaton on the question of whether can autistic people experience musically evoked emotions, and starting from the assumption that autistic people are probably people with feelings, we came to the conclusion that they do. And then now my PhD is all about the social environment and secondary school and how that affects development and things like seeking social status versus seeking intimacy, self-silencing type behaviors, so camouflaging and masking, but also in typical individuals.
James Cusack, who is autistic himself and the current CEO of Autistica, one of the leading autism charities in the UK.
Yeah, I was diagnosed as being autistic at the age of 12, but I was identified quite early on, really at the age of 3. And so I've really had the privilege of growing up alongside a range of other autistic people with a range of different needs. And it was really fascinating to me to understand how we can best support such a diverse group of different autistic people. And so that's what led me to doing my PhD, my postdoc. But during that, I was also involved in a range of different policy discussions. So in particular, the Scottish Autism Strategy, which I helped campaign for and really led by the National Autistic Society. And as I came to the end of my postdoc, I really began to feel that really we needed to begin to think a lot more strategically about how autism research ultimately makes a difference. And that was really what I was passionate about, was really ensuring that autism research does ultimately end in improving autistic people's lives. And that was why I joined Autistica, because I saw a huge opportunity to do that.
So lastly, but certainly not least, let me introduce you, Dr. Caroline Richards. And Caroline, would you like to tell us a little bit more about yourself and your research?
Yeah, I am a clinical psychologist. I lead a team of researchers at the University of Birmingham, which is an immense privilege because I get to work with some of the smartest people I've ever met. And we are really focused on doing research that is going to make a real world difference here and now to mainly children with neurodevelopmental conditions. My background and training has been in intellectual disabilities research and crosses over into autism, and we'll kind of come on to that later, but I have a real passion for seeing our autism research be inclusive of the whole autism community, including those who have co-occurring intellectual disability or who speak few or no words and are often excluded from the mainstream autism research. I also, as perhaps many of the panel members also themselves are, represent different categories, different perspectives. So I'm also an older sister to an autistic young man who also has a severe intellectual disability. And I guess relevant to issues around diversity, I'm also biracial. I have a Black Jamaican dad and a white mum.
In your opinion, how inclusive is autism research currently?
So sometimes it's really very, very inclusive. And I think that the hallmarks of those kinds of spaces are places where, it's not, the autistic people are present because of our expertise. And that expertise might be our professional expertise, or it might be our lived expertise, rather than as like a prop or a token. And I think it does seem to be happening more. I also think, though, that the spaces that are the most autism inclusive in research in general are spaces where the person in charge, the professor, the principal investigator, the head of the lab, whoever, is autistic. There's constant references to a deficit. I mean, how many times have you started reading a paper on autism and the first thing it says is autism is a developmental disorder characterized by a persistent deficit in empathy? Because it's incredibly dehumanizing to be told that you don't empathize when maybe not any, but I think a lot of autistic people will tell you that we really do experience empathy. It's just different. I went to a conference, I won't say which conference, on autism research, where the hall with all the posters with people's projects on was just, I couldn't be in there for more than 5 minutes. And I'm not at the high end of like sensory sensitivity of the whole spectrum of autistic people. I'm not somebody who suffers from it that much in that way, but I couldn't be there. And so that was one less autistic researcher having a conversation about autism research at that autism conference.
Thank you, Rubes. Desi, the same question to you.
So I love working as an autism researcher, but I really do have to be honest here. I think that the field of autism research, especially in the United States where I am, has a serious problem with inclusivity. So an example of this is while more journals are encouraging the report of participant demographics, an overwhelming number of autism research studies fail to even report this information. And then if you look at those that do report demographic information, we find that the majority of participants are white, middle-class children with IQs in the average range. So this leaves out a significant portion of the autistic population. And then in addition to that, we find that the majority of validated autism research measures are in English. So we often don't have the appropriate tools to diagnose autism in populations where English isn't the first language, including immigrants or people in many low or middle income countries who already experience trouble accessing these services.
You're an older sister to your brother who is autistic and has a severe intellectual disability. How have your own personal experiences informed what you do as a clinical psychologist and researcher?
I feel incredibly privileged to know my brother and love my brother, as I'm sure everyone feels about their own sibling. I think that my relationship with him means that my first experience of autism wasn't as something to be studied, but it was as a person to have a relationship with. And it was as somebody to understand and learn from. And increasingly, as his high levels of support needs became apparent, it was somebody to advocate with and for, so that he could live the happiest and healthiest life that was possible for him. And so when I later came to study psychology, my focus on autism wasn't kind of informed by textbooks, but was shaped by a relational experience of an autistic person. Our lab almost exclusively focuses on the things that Maya touched on earlier. So we don't do research into cause. We don't really do any neuroimaging research. We focus on the clinical challenges that are faced more commonly by autistic people than by non-autistic people. We focus on things like sleep problems, problems with mental health, and behaviours that can be perceived as challenging. Our research is all about trying to understand why for some autistic people those difficulties are higher than for other autistic people, and thinking about how we can alter service design and service delivery to change that.
That's great, thank you. James, we have an audience question for you. How can we best involve autistic people in autism research, do you feel?
So I think it's important if you're going to involve autistic people in research, and in my experience, I've been involved in examples where it's been done well and when it's been done less well, to be honest with you. I think the key thing is to ensure that you're involving people as early as possible, so that you don't have the research fully designed, then you involve people in a sort of focus group way. I think to have people involved early doors is really, really important to ensure there's a shared respect and values for people's different types of knowledge, because everyone brings different lived experience, different knowledge, and you know, I think there's sometimes this sort of false dichotomy between autistic people and researchers, and you know, it's important to remember autistic people have expertise beyond their lived experience, and researchers have lived experience which affects their expertise, and so on, to ensure that those things, and to ensure that you have that respect and understanding that everyone brings different things to the table, and to be innovative and think about different ways in which you can involve a diverse range of different perspectives. And so we've done things like workshops in the past, but there's a range of different ways that you can involve people, and I think different approaches are useful for different people as well.
Thank you very much. Desi, why do you feel it's so important that we have more Black and minority ethnic researchers?
Here's the interesting thing. Research does suggest that when Black patients have a doctor who's also Black, they feel more comfortable, more trusting, and they have better health outcomes. So we think this could be applied to autism research too. In fact, many Black caregivers report feeling that white researchers can't understand their experiences. And some even report that they felt their providers were racially insensitive or had biases and misconceptions about Black family structures that were really offensive and harmful. So having people from diverse backgrounds get involved in our research may help to increase racial sensitivity in researchers and help us to build better relationships with people in racial and ethnic minority communities. And this can help people from these backgrounds, including Black people, to feel more comfortable and more open to participating in our research.
You recently designed an autism acceptance training program which targeted biases that non-autistic people have about people with autism. Could you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, of course. So we actually adapted our training program. It was previously designed by researchers at Simon Fraser University in Canada. It was an in-person training for high school students, developed in collaboration with a group of autistic adults, kind of like what we talked about earlier. But it included short clips of autistic people just describing their experiences. Then it had information on autistic strengths, neurodiversity, recommendations on how to interact with autistic people, even a simulation of sensory overload. So we adapted this for an adult audience. I had a narration added to make it a training video instead of an in-person training. And we wanted to see whether this autism-specific training did a better job at reducing biases toward autism compared to a more general mental health-focused training. And then in addition to a comparison to no training at all. And we found that that our training did reduce a lot of explicit biases toward autism. So people who did our training compared to people who did just general mental health training or no training at all had fewer instances of these more overt forms of prejudice. So they had better first impressions of autistic adults, fewer misconceptions about autism, more favorable beliefs about autistic abilities. But when we looked at implicit biases, which are more automatic, unconscious associations that we make, we found that participants, regardless of whether or not they received training, made associations between autism and unpleasant personal attributes like dependency, dangerousness, social awkwardness. So the training, while it helped with some of these forms of bias, it didn't do enough to help with all forms. And we don't know whether it translates to real world interactions yet. So we still need further research, further work to see how to improve these things.
Thank you, Des. It sounds very worthwhile. Caroline, you're one of the currently very few people of colour within autism research. What has this been like for you, and can you tell us why academics from POC backgrounds are underrepresented in autism research, in your opinion?
What I would want to start by saying is I've been incredibly well supported through my career, and I think sometimes we don't see the privilege that people carry. I want to make that clear kind of upfront. My dad has a PhD. He was a young Black man in the 70s getting a PhD in London, and that had a huge impact on what I believed I could achieve. I've also been really well supported by some really progressive, fantastic white researchers who've used their voices to give me space and lift me up. What I would say is that for the first, 8 or 9 years of my training at university level, I did a lot of sort of degree study, a bit of a geek. I was not taught by a single person who was not white. And that has an impact on your career trajectory and on your beliefs about the world. There's this kind of old adage that you can't be what you can't see. And I really believe that. And so I think there is a huge challenge in academia and in autism research specifically about who we see, whose voices are primary, and they are currently not representative of a population of researchers at even an undergraduate level. Those who rise to the top are not representative of that initial pool, but they're also not representative of the service users that we seek to support. They're not representative of the autism world.
Thank you, Caroline. Rubes, another group that is currently underrepresented in autism research is cis and transgender females and non-binary identifying individuals. How do you think the way in which autistic traits are measured is problematic for women and minorities and leads to non-diagnosis?
Well, I think in the previous panel, Sari mentioned Sheldon as the kind of archetypal idea of what an autistic person is. And also, she also alluded to the fact that he might not really meet the criteria. So I think that there's clearly a cultural understanding of what autism is that is skews very male and also very kind of masculine, if you like. And I think it's important to remember where this all started, right? Like the conversations that we're having now about autistic people, Melanie Yergo in her book on authoring autism talks about the idea that, any statement about autism is a statement about the diagnostic criteria, because that's kind of all we've got to orient ourselves to this phenomenon, if you like. I've written in my notes colonial gender norms. This is about colonial gender norms. It's about the idea of empathy and social communication as women's work, and science as a masculine thing, or systematic thinking as a masculine thing. Even going so far back as the refrigerator mothers theory, it's all about this idea of a particular acceptable way of having a family, and having relationships between people, and how gender and sex are a part of that. So I think that's how we've got to a situation where we have criteria that are so skewed in the way that they are. There are reasons why people are socialized as women, whether that's implicitly or explicitly socialized as women or girls, tend to do social communication in a way that is less noticeably autistic. And I think it comes back to this thing of empathy as women's work, but it's also in parenting styles. There's a classic study from the 90s, I think, showing that parents, when they think that the infant is a girl, they do a lot more talking, and when they think it's a boy, they do a lot more like physical play, or like things where motor and spatial reasoning are important. And so we get this, we have this situation where little, young autistic people who are being socialized as female in whatever way that's happening, are developing in a different social environment effectively from the boys. Of course, this is all terribly binary, and I'm not.
Something that I've not thought about before, actually. Yes, the role of kind of the way that gender normative and heteronormative society basically, it makes it so much more difficult to expose the differences in autistic girls. And that's it's almost like the system is set up to diagnose autistic boys, but not so much autistic girls. Thank you, Rubes. Can you share with us Autisticus' visions going forwards and how you are advocating for more inclusive autism research?
So, I think for us, I think there's something fairly fundamental here, which is that autistic people and their families, from the moment they find out they're autistic, are really exposed to quite significant uncertainty around what happens next, and we don't really expose other groups of people to this uncertainty. And so as an autism research charity, I think one of the things that's really key for us is to really shout about the fact that research and evidence is actually really critical for autistic people and their families, and because we don't try things on other groups of people that don't work, but we seem to think that this is something that is acceptable for autistic people and their families. What we really want to do is be setting big goals over the next decade to ensure that over the next 10 years, we really are ensuring that there is proven support for autistic people, from day one, to ensure that autistic people have, again, proven support, when they do have issues with anxiety and mental health, which we know is a real priority for autistic people and their families for research, to increase the rates of employment. We know that from data from the Office of National Statistics that only 21.7% of autistic people are in employment. We know lots more autistic people would like to be in employment and have a huge amount to offer in that setting. We should be improving healthcare for autistic people. We know that life expectancy is lower than autistic people, shockingly so, and so avoidably so, and that autistic people have increased numbers of health problems which aren't identified. So we're looking at how we can deliver health checks for autistic people. In terms of being more inclusive, again, I think, we all have substantial amounts to do, and that includes Autistica, to ensure that we're including different groups appropriately in research. Charities have their own issues, so there's a campaign at the moment out called Charity So White, which really shows that charities are overwhelmingly white as well as research. And so I think we have work to do to ensure that as a workplace we're as inclusive as possible. I think it's about ensuring we've got an insight group of autistic people and family members. It's ensuring you're engaging with all diverse range of communities and in checking your assumptions, and in doing so being comfortable with the fact that you will get conflicting views as well. And I think that that's something which we need to become more comfortable within autism research. There are different autistic people are having very different lived experiences of the world, and that means that they're likely to have different views and experiences, and maybe will require different things from autism research.
I completely agree. I I think getting used to hearing the voice of autistic people more and more, even when it makes researchers uncomfortable, even when researchers disagree with the autism community. At the end of the day, it is the autism community whose needs need to be served best. And as has been said a couple of times in both panels, it is autistic people who have that lived experience. No one else has that lived experience other than autistic people, and it's their voice that has to guide the way. Caroline, what is the best way to support anxiety, distress in autistic individuals with learning disabilities who are non-verbal?
Okay, so I'm going to draw on some work that, in fact, Autistica are funding. Not my work. One of my colleagues in the Cerebra Network, Dr. Jane Waite, leads a programme of research at Aston University, and she's really working with her team to try and answer this question. I think if Jane was here, she would say a couple of things. The first thing she would say is that the tools we currently have to identify someone who is experiencing anxiety are not good enough to pick up anxiety in people who are autistic and also have a learning disability. So as clinicians, we often rely on people being able to say things like, when I go into this situation, I feel like this, or when this happens, I feel I need to avoid this. And those are the kinds of cues that help us to understand that what someone's experiencing is anxiety. If somebody can't talk to you about that internal experience, you have to look at other ways of trying to work out what they're experiencing. And one of our key challenges when somebody also has an intellectual disability or they speak few or no words is that the way that somebody might present might indicate they're experiencing anxiety, but it might indicate that they're in pain because they've got a headache. It might indicate that their mood is really low. It might indicate that they're really tired. And our tools at the moment, our assessment tools, do not well enough differentiate those different internal experiences for people who do not have the language to communicate that to us verbally. So one of the things Jane is working on is developing more precise tools to pick anxiety up. And that involves talking a lot with parents and carers who know their children and young people really well, but it also involves other methods of observing those young people themselves directly and finding ways from their behaviour for us to understand when they're anxious.
So I think that we need to take a multifaceted approach to improving the involvement of people from diverse communities in our research. So it's really important to have people from diverse backgrounds contributing to a research team. I mentioned this earlier. So while I highlighted the importance of racial and ethnic diversity in these roles, but I also want to emphasize that I think it's also important to include autistic people themselves and autistic people of color in our research in these roles, contributing to the studies and kind of as collaborators. So second, I think that we really need to promote community engagement. And when I say community engagement, what I mean is that we need to build meaningful connections with communities of color and work with community leaders to promote mutual trust and respect. So researchers need to step down from the ivory tower and work to disseminate our work to people in non-academic contexts.
Rubes, I'm a white cisgendered gay man. We are very good at getting ourselves heard in my experience. How do you feel that people on the autism spectrum can get involved in working in autism research, particularly other members of the LGBTQ community?
People who bring kind of disability studies thinking with them into medical model type research, I think is really crucial, because if we're going to be able to understand the ways in which our experiences as autistic people, our differences as autistic people, you know, if we're going to be able to understand the relationship between that and our way exaggerated risk of stress-related health problems, etc., we need to really dig into that interplay. You really need someone in your corner, someone who gets you. And then I think, you know, if we're talking about somebody who is LGBTQ as well as autistic, I mean, first of all, there are a lot of us. And I think that's just on its own something that we should talk about and maybe even be a little bit overtly happy about, that autistic people, it seems like, have a lot of courage to be who they are, even when we're told that we shouldn't be. And maybe that tells us something about autism as well as it does about LGBT people. But I think I think in a way it's a very similar argument, right? That if you want to find a place to work where you're going to be included as an LGBTQ person, you need to look at the way that those people are thinking about LGBTQ people.
You mentioned low rates of employment amongst autistic people. I just wondered what you might say about the phenomenon of underreporting autism by adults in work, masking at work, a lack of access to support, especially for folks diagnosed as adults. That's a question from our audience. What would you have to say about that phenomenon?
So yeah, I think it's a huge issue, and there's no doubt that there are some people who are autistic who don't feel that they can report that they're autistic, or who may not know that they're autistic as well. So I think that has to be factored in. You know, we fund a research initiative at University College London, which is looking at autism and employment. It's called DARE. And we see that there's significant barriers to entering work. So we know that you know, from the moment the recruitment process begins, there's significant biases in place, and there are things that you can do to change that. And I think the real key principle here is that if your workplace recruits effectively, you will recruit autistic people. So, you know, if you have a process which is not biased, which is ultimately designed to attract the most talented people, you've got a really good chance that you will also be employing autistic people. And also what we see is that what a lot of this really boils down to in terms of disclosure in the workplace is workplaces becoming comfortable with difference and different ways of thinking and different approaches to things. And I really do believe that, you know, if workplaces can come to understand and accept autistic people, then actually they can also accept other forms of neurodiversity and themselves as well. And I think, you know, when we start thinking about reasonable adjustments, you know, so things, you know, sort of, you know, that help deal with potentially sensory difficulties, you know, things like noise cancelling headphones and so on. When we start thinking about these for autistic people, they apply to all people as well. And when we do that, everyone wins. And I think that's, you know, that's the real things that there appears to be a stigma behind admitting that you have any form of difference or different way of thinking. And we need to really remove that from the workplace and get autistic people to be comfortable with disclosing their diagnosis, but also to ensure that all people feel comfortable, you know, making sure that they can disclose what their preferences are. I feel very conscious that, you know, I'm in a very privileged position to be able to be open about who I am. But the reality is that because of the stigma that does exist around autism, quite understandably, a number of autistic people don't feel comfortable doing so. So there needs to be support in place to ensure that that can happen, as well as huge changes in attitudes.
Final question, which I think is very important. What area in autism research is most understudied, in your opinion? James, I'll kick off with you.
For me, I think there's definitely a lack of understanding regarding how we reach underrepresented groups. But, you know, to focus on a specific topic, I would probably go back to the attitudes and understanding area, because I think that we understand an awful lot about things like, or beginning to understand things about anxiety, but there's a lot of public awareness and public understanding campaigns going on, as we've seen this week and this month. I'm sure we'll see more of this month. But actually, it's really important that we think about how we change these attitudes and behaviours and implicit biases that Desi was referring to. And that's a research question, and if we don't treat it like a research question, the reality is we could end up wasting an awful lot of resource, not doing a very effective job of changing people's attitudes and understanding around autism.
Okay, thank you, James. Rubes?
It's very connected to that. I would say there's the whole double empathy problem area has just kind of opened up. That's really going to be really, really beneficial to start to really understand how being misunderstood, right? By the fact that neurotypical people are bad at empathy when the person they're empathizing with is autistic, and understanding what role that has to play in the whole kind of developmental picture of autism is something I think is really, really, really important. And I think without it, we're not going to get much further in understanding any of the biological stuff anyway.
Okay. Thank you, Rubes. Caroline?
I think my answer actually is similar to the previous two. I think it's something about how do we as a society change the systems and structures, whether they be education or clinical provisions, so that all autistic people and all those with an intellectual disability, those without, have the chance to lead a life that for them is meaningful and happy and healthy, that isn't sort of focused on the outcomes that society tells us people should want, but is focused on the outcomes that autistic people want for themselves.
Thank you, Caroline. And Desi?
I think that it's essential that we incorporate more intersectional work. So right now there isn't much work at all looking at how things like, racial differences or gender differences, how those interact with autism to influence people's biases towards autistic people. So how do racial biases impact Black or Latinx or Asian autistic people? How does it interact their interactions with doctors, with the police? There are so many things that different diverse autistic people bring to the table that aren't being incorporated in these other areas of research. So I think you need to look at these things collectively as a whole to see how they interact. And that's really not something that we do right now.
Thank you, Desi. Big thanks to the members of our second panel. I thoroughly enjoyed the discussions. We really appreciate you sharing your expertise and experiences with us.